We'll take as our text this morning Esther chapter 2, and we'll read that chapter now. Esther chapter 2. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given to them, and let the young women who please the king be queen. The young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is, Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother had died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, and the custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in the custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointment for women, when the young woman went in to the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her, and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except for what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting in the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. This is the word of our God. May it stand firm and may it stand sure forevermore. Beloved congregation of our Lord Jesus Christ, Our text opens with a rather curious statement that when the king's anger had cooled, he remembered Vashti and how he had responded to her rebellion. And we might find ourselves wondering, well, how is that possible? How could Xerxes possibly have forgotten about events which had been of such enormous personal and indeed political significance? Well, the key to appreciating what's happened here is to know that Xerxes had had a long time to cool his jets. And that's because there's actually a gap of several years between the events of chapter 1 and chapter 2. And during those years, Xerxes had been a busy fellow. Now, what had occupied him during that time was the business of making war on the Greeks. And as we learned last time in our sermon on chapter 1, things hadn't gone very well for Xerxes in that department. Though the Persians had not been routed, the Greeks had succeeded in fighting them to a standstill. And from a public relations standpoint, that had proven absolutely disastrous for Xerxes. And here's the thing, it wasn't just a matter of returning home in disgrace as a defeated king. Xerxes had also come back broke. And so had everyone else who had supported him. You see, that was the thing about waging war in the ancient world. The only way to pay for everything was by plundering your defeated foes. Xerxes and his nobles, they had raised and they had supplied their armies through a combination of taxes and personal investment. And what that meant is that they had invested both their personal wealth as well as the wealth of the empire in Xerxes' ill-fated plot against the Greeks. And they had done so because they not only expected to recoup their losses, they expected to profit handsomely by plundering the Greek kingdom. The trouble, however, is that you only get to plunder when you win. And the upshot of Xerxes' defeat then was that nobody got any glory and nobody got any gold. And that was a huge problem for an ancient king, because at the end of the day, there are only two things that a king in that time was supposed to supply for his subjects, and that was gold and glory. And that meant that by the time that Xerxes got back to Susa, his approval ratings were in the tank, and he was a very grumpy king who was decidedly on edge. And it is in these circumstances that Xerxes remembers Vashti. And let's be clear, when Xerxes remembers Vashti, it's not out of any sense of fondness or regret, nor was he motivated by loneliness. After all, narcissists like Xerxes can't be lonely. They've always got themselves. And it wasn't for want of physical intimacy either. There were many other ways in which those needs could be met. And that might leave us wondering, well, if those weren't the motivating factors, what was it that suddenly sparked Xerxes' desire to find a queen? Well, the key to answering that question is to recognize that while any woman could provide him with company and any woman could provide him with sexual satisfaction, there was one thing that only a queen could give him, and that was a legitimate legal heir. And knowing that, it helps us to appreciate that when Xerxes acts in these verses, he is motivated entirely by a sense of self-interest and self-preservation. What we have to understand is that Xerxes here was searching for a queen because he found himself in desperate straits. Now, to help make that clear, I want you to just imagine for a moment. I want you to imagine that you are Memucan, or perhaps one of the other 7 advisors that we read about last week in chapter 1. But for the moment, imagine that you are Memucan. Your king has just returned after being soundly defeated in a fight that he started. And it's not just that he's been disgraced, he's also been impoverished. And so have you. And so has everybody who invested in this scheme. Now, you are understandably upset about these circumstances. And in your anger, you begin wondering if just maybe you could be better served by a more competent and capable ruler. Perhaps someone who could actually make good on his promises to bring you gold and glory. And as you're stewing on those thoughts, as you're mulling over those ideas, it suddenly occurs to you that the king doesn't have an heir. You suddenly realize that Xerxes had put Vashti aside, and by extension, he had also delegitimized any children or heirs that he had had with her, which meant that, hypothetically, if something were to happen to Xerxes, let's say he was to fall down a flight of stairs or to have a hunting accident, or maybe if he ate something that disagreed with him, then there would be no one standing in line to inherit the crown. And without an heir, the crown of Persia, it would be up for grabs. And in such circumstances, couldn't a well-positioned individual perhaps grab hold of that crown for themselves? And suddenly what we realize is that Xerxes remembers what had happened to Vashti because everybody else has remembered what happened to Vashti. He looked around at all of those advisors he had once trusted, and he sees the predatory look in their eyes, and he came to the stunning realization that if he was going to survive this situation, he needed a queen, and he needed one now. But while this mighty ruler is capable of seeing the problem, he isn't capable of formulating a solution. And so once again, he turns to his advisors for direction. Though this time we do have to give Xerxes some credit. He's smart enough to bypass his senior advisors and to go to the young men at court. Xerxes may have been a narcissistic tyrant, but he wasn't a complete dullard. And he knew better than to expose his belly to the other alpha males in the kingdom. And these young courtiers, they aren't stupid either, because they see this opportunity for what it really is. It's a chance to advance their own cause by marrying one of their sisters or one of their daughters into the royal family. After all, if you can't be the king, the next best thing is to make sure that you enjoy the king's favor. And what better way could there be to win the king's favor than to marry one of your own into the royal family? But here's the thing. Here's the thing, you've got to be careful. Because men like Xerxes, they can smell self-interest from a mile away. And these young courtiers, they don't want to spook him. So they cloak. They cloak their true intentions by suggesting that Xerxes conduct an empire-wide search for a new queen. Now, of course, they make this suggestion knowing full well that the Persian kings had a long history of choosing their queens only from families with pure Persian bloodlines. And so they never imagined, not even for a moment, not in their wildest dreams, that a foreigner, let alone a foreigner of lowly birth, might actually be a threat to their plans to seat one of their own on the throne. And so once again, we watch as the most powerful man in the world gets played like a fiddle. His courtiers sense his fear, and they respond by inciting his lust. And predictably, Xerxes is delighted by their suggestion. And what follows can only be described as exploitation on a grand scale, as a group of young women are taken, and taken is precisely the right word to use here because none of these women voluntarily enter this contest. This was a contest that they were drafted into. We watch as many young women from across the empire are taken from their homes and effectively imprisoned in the palace. And there, in splendid isolation for an entire year, they're beautified and they're trained in the sensual arts. And they endured all of this. They endured all of this so that for just one night, they could be escorted to the king's bedchamber, where they could be used for his pleasure. And after which, all but one of them would be consigned to live out the remainder of their lives in the seclusion of the king's harem. Now, I can appreciate, brothers and sisters, how at this point you may be thinking to yourself, well, Okay, temple, that's all fine and dandy. But you gave us a history lesson last week, and we're getting another one today, and is all of this history really necessary? Well, let's stop. Let's stop for a moment and consider what we've learned, and let's apply it to the flow of the story so far. In chapter 1, we were introduced to the world of the Persian Empire, and we were introduced to that empire at a time when it was at the height of its power. And in that chapter, we were given a big picture view of Persian power and glory. That was important because we needed to be taught a lesson about how to view the kingdoms of men as God's children. But now, in the opening verses of chapter 2, we discover that the camera's focus has narrowed dramatically. Instead of looking at the whole of the empire, our attention is now focused on Xerxes and Xerxes' personal predicament. And brothers and sisters, that's intentional. God is deliberately narrowing our focus here. And He's doing so that we come to stare directly into the heart of this empire. And He wants us to see that this empire is rotten to its core. And recognizing that there's a transition in these two chapters is critical, because whereas in chapter 1, God is showing us the limits of human power, in chapter 2, He's showing us the depths of its depravity. And this expose of the corruption of human power, it serves two very important purposes. First, it reveals the truth that the kingdoms of men are focused on feeding the lusts of men. Think about what we've learned this morning. Far from serving the common good, the massive edifice of the Persian Empire existed solely to satisfy the needs of one man. And there are no links to which Xerxes won't go in order to satisfy those needs. It's clear from these verses that not only does the common good mean nothing to Xerxes, neither do individual rights and freedoms. Ultimately, if saving his bacon meant that hundreds of women would be ripped from their homes, used for his pleasure, and then consigned to a lifetime of imprisonment, well, that was just the cost of doing business. Their happiness, their lives, meant nothing to him. But the truly staggering thing to realize, beloved, is that the entire system of Persian society supported him in the perpetration of these atrocities. And why was that so? Well, it was so because the people who inhabited Xerxes' empire were all desperately trying to become him. And so they're not just willing to turn a blind eye to these abuses of power, they're willing to participate in them, all in the hopes that doing so will advance their own cause and progress their own glory. Don't kid yourself. You can be absolutely certain that the moment Xerxes agreed to this plan of rounding up virgins from across the empire, there would have been a mad scramble as the young men of court all raced home to figure out which of their sisters and which of their daughters was the prettiest. There were many, many young women who found themselves being offered up that night as their families sacrificed them on the altar of self-interest. And if we're honest, we'd have to assume that faced with the prospect of becoming queen, at least some of those women must have concluded that their virtue was a small price to pay for such an opportunity. And all of this drives home the point that the kingdoms of men are ultimately kingdoms of self, which means that the most shocking discovery we make as we study these verses is that the Persian Empire was nothing more than the sinful heart of man writ large. And the window that God has opened into the heart of this empire, it turns out to be a window that looks directly into the depths of my own heart. For the truth is that the same self-centered heart that beat within Xerxes beats within me as well.
The truth is that without the gracious intervention of God, I would pursue the lusts of the flesh in precisely the same way that he did. And so as we read these verses, God not only opens our eyes to the corrupt foundations of human power, he also moves us to confess, along with all the saints, there but for the grace of God go I. These opening verses, however, they also serve another purpose, because by means of these verses, the Lord prepares us for another transition in the story. In chapter 1, he's given us a wide-angle view of the Persian Empire. In the opening verses of chapter 2, our focus gets narrowed down to a consideration of its heart. But then in verse 5, our perspective shifts once again, and we're now shown what life was like for those who lived as citizens of this empire. More specifically, we're shown what it was like for God's children to live as citizens of that empire. To that end, we're rather suddenly introduced to two Jews, Mordecai and his cousin Esther, and they were descendants of those who had first been carried into exile by Nebuchadnezzar roughly a century ago. And for us, this shift in focus comes as a welcome change. It's a breath of fresh air. Because to this point, we've been dealing with powerful and perverted Persians, and their behavior has provoked both our laughter and our disgust. But now, as we're introduced to a couple of hometown Hebrews, we get excited about the possibility of learning about some of our own. But brothers and sisters, we can't lose sight of the fact that what we have been taught in verses 1 through 4 is intended to prepare us to read and to interpret the remainder of the chapter. And I really want to emphasize that here this morning, because as we make our way through this passage, it's possible that our enthusiasm for reading about the exploits of Mordecai and about Esther, it's possible that our enthusiasm begins to wane somewhat. And I say that because our expectation is likely that amidst all of this corruption and amidst all of this immorality, that our hometown Hebrews are going to stand out as shining beacons of purity and truth. But the trouble is that things don't seem to work out that way. In fact, what we discover is that it actually proves rather difficult to distinguish between the citizens of God's kingdom and the citizens of Xerxes' empire. We've been hoping to find heroes, and what we discover are folks who look more like conformists. Consider what we've been told about Esther in this passage, for instance. While Esther is undoubtedly powerless to resist being dragooned into participating in this travesty, once she's in the harem, her behavior can leave us feeling rather conflicted. Undoubtedly, for instance, the year-long process of beautification would have involved a diet that was regulated by her Persian masters. And that diet would surely have included foods which the Jews were forbidden to eat. And yet there is no indication here in this passage that, like Daniel, Esther tried to find some way to avoid becoming unclean. And while Esther certainly hadn't chosen this fate, our text makes it clear that once she's within the walls of the harem, she excels in that world. And it appears that she excels not by standing out, but by fitting in. Consider how she wins Haggai's favor. She wins his favor precisely because she's not only willing to get with the program, she's willing to follow it to the letter. And then there's the very uncomfortable fact that ultimately Esther wins this competition. And remember, brothers and sisters, that the only way to win was for her to please the king, an unclean Gentile to whom she was not married, and she had to please him better than any of the other women had done. And again, not only does the text provide no indication that, like Joseph, she shook herself out of her vest and fled from Potiphar's wife. There's no indication that in this text she struggled to avoid her fate. In fact, the suggestion seems to be that when her time came, she went, and she went intending to win. More troubling still is Mordecai's behavior. Now, we know from the text that Mordecai had become Esther's surrogate father, and he undoubtedly cared for her very deeply. So it's quite understandable that when she is taken from her, that Mordecai will want to continue to protect her. But what are we to make of his insistence that she hide her Jewish identity? How could a faithful man of God ever tell his child to hide her light beneath a bushel basket? Given that God calls us to confess his name before all men, in all circumstances, regardless of the cost, how could Mordecai possibly tell Esther to conceal her heritage? Well, brothers and sisters, as we try to work our way through these feelings, it's important to remember what it is precisely that our text does tell us and what it doesn't. And in terms of what it doesn't tell us, we have to say right from the outset that our text does not provide us with any sense of what Mordecai and Esther were thinking and feeling as these events unfolded. We're not told, for instance, what Esther's state of mind was as she was led to Xerxes' bedchamber. Was she reluctant or eager? Was she remorseful or determined? We're simply not told. And the same is true of Mordecai. We're not specifically told, for instance, whether or not he'd hidden his own Jewish identity. And we're not told precisely what motivated him to tell Esther to do the same. Was Mordecai a man of weak faith, or was he a man of sensible pragmatism? Again, the text just doesn't tell us. What's notable, however, is that there's something else that's missing from this text. And what's missing is any form of praise or condemnation of their choices and actions. There's no moral evaluation of their behavior to be found anywhere in these verses. We simply aren't told why they did what they did, and we aren't told whether the way that they responded to their circumstances was laudable or reprehensible. All we're told is how they acted within the circumstances that they found themselves. But there's certainly information in this passage that we have been given. Yes, there are things that God has chosen not to tell us. In his wisdom, there's information that he's withheld from us. But it's nevertheless true that we've been provided with precisely what we need in order to be able to come to grips with this text and to be encouraged by it. And in that sense, brothers and sisters, I'd like to point out two critical pieces of information that were given in this chapter. First of all, we're told where Esther and Mordecai were. And finally, we're told that where they are isn't where they're going to stay. First of all, then, our text tells us where Mordecai and Esther are. And where they are is in Susa, which was one of the capital cities of the Persian Empire. More specifically, we're told that Mordecai lived and worked in the citadel. Now, within the context of Susa, you had the city proper, but within that city there was a region known as the citadel. This was essentially a royal district within the city. This was where the king's palace was, and it was where his royal officials lived and worked. And we're also told that Esther is drawn into the world of the royal harem. And what we have to realize is that their location matters because in terms of this entire kingdom of self, the self who ruled this kingdom exercised complete control of these areas. There was nowhere else in the whole of his kingdom where Xerxes' power could be more directly applied, and therefore there was no place where the weight of his power came down more fully on his subjects. Which means, ironically, that those who lived within the confines of the citadel, they lived in the closest proximity to the great wealth and power of the Persian Empire, but they would also be the first to suffer from the exploitation and the corruption that flowed from its heart. And it's within this context that our two hometown Hebrews are trying to live and survive. It's here that Mordecai and Esther are trying to live out the calling of all believers. And that's the calling to be in the world, but not of it. And let's be honest, beloved, that's surely one of the most difficult challenges that we face as believers. And again, if we're honest, it's a challenge that we fail all the time, despite the fact that we live in a country like Canada. Ask yourselves this question: would your neighbors be easily able to distinguish between you and the folks who live around you? Do we stand out in our neighborhoods as shining beacons of purity and truth? Or do we look pretty much like every other suburban Canadian family? And here's the thing. If we so often fail to distinguish ourselves, despite the fact that we live in a free and a democratic society that possesses a developed sense of individual rights and freedoms, are we prepared to cast stones at Mordecai and Esther for the choices that they made as they lived within the shadow of Xerxes' throne? It's so easy for us to imagine how brave we would be if we were in their circumstances. We imagine that we would behave like Daniel, that we would behave like Joseph, and that no matter what the cost, we would let our light shine brightly for the Lord. But here's the thing, brothers and sisters, and I quote a profane source here. Here's the thing: the infamous boxer Mike Tyson once observed, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And what he meant by that is that we all think we're champions until the blows start landing. And we've got to remember that those are precisely the circumstances that Esther and Mordecai were trying to survive as they lived in the Persian Empire as God's children. And they weren't being punched by Mike Tyson. They were being punched by an empire. And being aware of where they are, it can help us to come to grips with some of the choices that they make. Think, for instance, of Mordecai's command that Esther hide her Jewish identity. Mordecai made that demand of Esther. He made that demand as a man who lived in Xerxes' court. He lived in the citadel. And so he knew what the consequences would be if Esther wasn't chosen as the queen. Understand that all of the women who didn't win this contest, they would have been shut up for the remainder of their lives in that second harem that's mentioned in this text. And that's because Xerxes, he couldn't risk the possibility that any children who might be born as a result of those liaisons would rise up to be a threat to his power. Now imagine for a moment that you are forced into this contest while you're still a young woman. Maybe you're 16, 17, 18 years of age, and you're swept up and you're brought to the harem, and you lose. Well, you never get to go home. You're going to be cast aside to live in complete neglect and isolation for the remainder of your days. And it might not be a natural remainder of your days either, because the reality of life in an ancient kingdom is that when a new king ascended the throne, he very quickly liquidated the harem of his predecessors. Those are the circumstances that Esther gets caught up in. Which means, brothers and sisters, that we need to stop thinking about this as a beauty contest, and we need to start thinking about it as being a back alley knife fight. And when you're fighting for your life, you can't afford to give your opponent the slightest advantage. And Mordecai knew that within the world of the harem, information was power. And he understood that Esther, she couldn't afford to give her enemies any leverage that could be used against her. And we need to remember that Mordecai would also have known what the other young men at the court knew, which was that the Persian kings had this established practice of choosing women with pure Persian bloodlines to be their queen. And so in that context, being identified as a Jewess could only have hurt Esther's chances. Now that might not justify Mordecai's decision, but it sure does help to explain it. And brothers and sisters, we need to see here the importance once again of that shift in perspective that occurs between chapter 1 and chapter 2. Because it's easy to laugh at the power of men when you're looking at things from the vantage point of heaven, but it's a lot harder when you're sitting amidst the mud and mire of life in this broken world. And so this chapter, it reminds us that living as God's children in this sinful, broken world, it's a hard and it's a messy business. And all too often, we aren't up for the task. We don't always make the right choices. We don't always respond the way we should to our circumstances. And the reality is that all too often, we prove to be pragmatists rather than heroes, and conformists rather than witnesses. The reason that's so, it has everything to do with the heart that beats within us. The heart that beats within me is a sinful heart. It's a Xerxes heart. And that means that sometimes when we're confronted by the hard decisions of this life, we don't know what to do. And sometimes even when we do know what's right, we lack the strength to follow through. Should Mordecai have told Esther to stand out from the crowd by revealing her Jewish identity? Maybe. Perhaps she would have won. Perhaps she would have won Haggai's favor in the way that Daniel had found favor in the Babylonian court. Or perhaps she would have ended up discarded and dead. Who's to say? Certainly not us, that's for sure. But the wonderful comfort of this chapter is that whatever the rightness or the wrongness of their motives, whatever the rightness or the wrongness of their decisions, Mordecai and Esther, they have not been left alone to fend for themselves in this world. And that's something that this chapter reveals to us in the way that it ends. The way that this chapter concludes, it reveals to us that where Mordecai and Esther are is not where they're going to stay. And that's because the sovereign God of history, He is watching over His people, and He is aware of all their struggles and their strife. He's working to ensure that they triumph over these circumstances, and He's doing so even if they don't realize it themselves. And that's made clear again by the way that this chapter ends. We're told at the conclusion of this chapter that Mordecai just happened to hear of a plot against Xerxes' life as he sat in the palace gates. And as those who read these words with the eyes of faith, we realize that there is absolutely nothing about this incident that is random. For we know that although he is not specifically mentioned in these verses, it is the Lord who has engineered these circumstances. It's the Lord who has caused these words to come to Mordecai's ears. And as a master storyteller, God is letting us see something of the way that He's at work in Mordecai's life. And He does so as a way of providing us a kind of clue, a kind of preview of coming attractions. As this chapter concludes, the reader is being told, get ready, keep watching, because I'm here, and I'm at work. And you can be sure that I am laboring to the good of my people, even in the midst of these sinful circumstances. But God isn't just signaling to us here that He is active in what's happening. He's also providing us with an incredible message of comfort. Because by ending this chapter the way He does, God is telling us that His power, that His grace, they're so much greater than the consequences of our sinful choices. It's true, He says. It's true that so often the way that you have chosen to navigate through this life proves both sinful and disastrous. And I know all too well what disastrous consequences your choices can have. But watch. Watch as I show you how my power is so much greater than your sin. Watch as I overcome and as I undo the sinful consequences of the choices that you've made. Brothers and sisters, Mordecai and Esther were exiles. That's something that's repeated over and over again through this passage. They are exiles. They are exiles who've been consigned to live in a hostile foreign land by the disobedience of their forefathers. And they were also sinners. They were sinners who so often had to bear the consequences of the sinful decisions that they made themselves. But they were also God's children. And so they could never be lost to the sin in which they had been born. They could not be lost to the sin into which they cast themselves. Which meant that where they were wasn't where they were going to remain. Because God would lead them from where they were to where they needed to be. He did so for Mordecai and Esther. And that's something we will see as this story unfolds. He's going to take them from that harem. He's going to take them from their courtyard. He's going to take them from their weakness and their short-sightedness, and he is going to move them to precisely where they need to be in order to accomplish his will and his plan and to save his people. But what he has done for Mordecai and Esther, he will do for all of his children. That's why we took a moment this morning to read from the Gospel of Luke, and to hear again the words of that thief who hung beside Jesus on the cross. Take a moment to think about that man's trajectory in life. You've got to conclude that nearly every decision that this man had ever made had been both sinful and disastrous. He was a murderer. He was a thief. He was a rebel. And now he's been nailed to a cross as a consequence of his own choices. A lifetime of sinfulness, a lifetime of disobedience and rebellion lay behind him. And yet in those final moments of his life, he acknowledged the truth of his circumstances. He turns to the other thief and he tells him to be quiet. And he says to that thief, we are where we are precisely as a consequence of the sinful choices that we have made. But then he looked to Jesus, and there he saw the one whom he knew wouldn't leave him where he was. He turned to the one who could help him to triumph over the sin and the suffering that he had both caused and endured. And he appeals to Jesus. He appeals to Jesus to take him from where he was and to bring him to where he needed to be. He looked at his life and he saw the morass of his sin. He saw all of the problems and the hardship and the grief and the suffering. And then he looked to Jesus and he saw the one who could lift him out of all of that, who could solve all of the problems that he couldn't, who could be righteous when he couldn't. And what does he say to him? Lord, promise me that I will be with you in your kingdom. Take me from where I am, nailed on this cross, and lead me to where I need to be. And how does Jesus respond? He responds with mercy, with a steadfast promise that his mercy was greater than this man's sin. And just like Mordecai and Esther's story, this man's story was recorded that we might have hope. Hope that if we acknowledge our sin, if we're honest about our shortcoming and we turn to the Lord, he will not let us be lost to the consequences of our own sinful choices. But he will take us from where we are to ultimately where we need to be. Amen.